Welcome to Season 3 of Voices of Australia, where we embark on a journey through the heart of social cohesion. In this thought-provoking podcast series, we delve into the diverse tapestry of Australian society, weaving together the stories, experiences and perspectives that contribute to our nation's unity. From conversations with community leaders and experts in their fields, to personal narratives of everyday Australians, Voices of Australia Series 3 explores the challenges and triumphs of fostering social cohesion in a dynamic and ever-evolving society. Whether you're a seasoned advocate for social harmony or just beginning to explore the nuances of Australian identity, this podcast invites you to listen, learn and engage in the vital dialogue surrounding social cohesion. Today I'm delighted to welcome two guests. First, Robin Scott. Robin is an experienced public policy practitioner and currently an industry professor at the Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalisation. Robin served in the Victorian State Parliament, where he held several ministerial roles, including as Minister for Finance, Multicultural Affairs, Assistant Treasurer and Minister for Veterans. Along with his deep commitment to critical and analytical thinking, Robin also has considerable experience influencing public policy and delivering strategic evidence-based decision-making. He played a central role in the development of the Victorian Government's response to extremism, including the process that led to the establishment of the Centre for Resilient and Inclusive Societies. Our second guest is Fotini Kypraios. Fotini is the founder and principal lawyer at Prisma Legal, a commercial legal practice specialising in commercial legal and governance advisory services to private business owners, the not-for-profit sector, boards and leadership teams in the corporate sector. Prisma Legal is a certified B Corporation, which is a business that meets the highest standards of verified social and environmental performance, transparency and accountability to balance profit and purpose. Fotini is a commercial lawyer of over 24 years' experience, a specialist accredited advisor through Family Business Association, and is Fellow of the Governance Institute of Australia, a qualified governance professional and company secretary, and she is the board chair of the Hellenic Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, chair of their national federation, and chair of the Bee Council for Bee Lab Australia and New Zealand. Fotini and Robin, it's a delight to have you both here with us. I'm thrilled to be able to have this conversation because we don't often talk about the role of business in relation to social cohesion, and it's such a crucial part. It's where lots of people spend most of their time. It's organisations that have a huge amount of influence over society. So it's going to be really an interesting time to really delve into what that relationship could or should or shouldn't be. So I just wondered, I thought I'd pose a question to both of you to start with, which is, how do you think in general terms, industries or businesses can actually contribute to social cohesion? How do you view social cohesion from a business type perspective?
I'm happy to start. I think business has a really critical role in a couple of ways. One is that economic participation is critical to people's sense of being able to contribute within a society. So businesses that are open to accepting people from different cultures, accepting people of different, of all sorts of different types of characteristics by which they define themselves, and having the ability, therefore, to be able to express talents, to feel that people are making that contribution and to have that recognised, that's a critical element of any socially cohesive society. So I think you can't separate that role. And the positive is that the more that businesses are open to people's talents, regardless of background, the more likely they are to get the best candidates, the more successful their business is likely to be. So, and I think also in terms of small business and medium-sized businesses, for newly particularly arrived migrant communities, that's a critical pathway to social and economic participation in the society. So I think there's within businesses themselves and then a more structural sort of role that people have in starting their own business or being associated with a business activity that starts up. And that is central, in fact, to the success of social cohesion, having that sense that everyone has a chance to make their mark and can be fairly recognised.
And an opportunity.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. And that they know that it's not likely to have hurdles based on where they've come from.
Exactly.
That they will be able to follow the same path as anybody else applying for those roles.
That I have the ability, I have these abilities, I have this dedication, this hard work and drive. I can make this mark in the new place that I've arrived in, or the place that my family have lived here for hundreds of years or thousands of years, the case may be. That's critical, I think, to a socially cohesive society.
Fotini, what about you?
Yes, well, I think also businesses have opportunities, not just as employers, and opening the doors for people to participate. And, financial independence is a huge issue for people from diverse backgrounds and disadvantaged backgrounds, but also as businesses looking up the chain and even opening the door at the procurement level and being more inclusive in terms of who we do business with and how we do business. Because at that higher end level of the B2B connection, there are a large number of communities or different demographics of industries that don't get their foot in the door to that procurement piece, which will elevate their business, as well as for businesses that are procuring in a diverse way to say, well, these are the businesses that we do business with, and this is why. So representation matters. And I think employment is also, work is a common language across all cultures and different backgrounds. So that commonality of enabling people to be successful, to be successful and to participate sort of plants the seeds, I think, in a society. And so as that wave starts at that grassroots level, that can lift us all up from the business owner right through to employers, people that are responsible for employing people, and participation generally. Yeah. So I think it's a knock-on effect.
So in many businesses, they employ somebody, usually in the HR department, that's responsible for diversity and inclusion. Do you think that's enough, I guess? I don't want to say the right thing. Do you think it's enough for businesses to simply do that, or do they need other elements? Because sometimes people who are within HR that are given that sort of a role don't necessarily feel like they've got the ability to influence broadly across a business. I'm thinking more of larger size businesses, but even the smaller ones, it's not necessarily a priority. It's just something that they assume they'll deal with at some point in time. So what do you think about these roles of diversity, inclusion, or DEI?
I think it's a complex question, because I think it's good to have within an organisation. Then the issue you raised, Anthea, which I think is important, is what ability does that role have to actually influence the organisation, and to what degree is a tick box, and that's where I think it can get trapped. That if you're just seeking to tick off a criteria rather than looking at the opportunities that exist and driving opportunities within the business, but also within the society for those talents to be expressed. So I think it's a question of what role and how effective, and whether the policies that people are enunciated and are being implemented have a good evidence base. There's some complexity in the implementation as well.
But having them stuck within HR does tend to suggest that their job is mostly around employment, recruitment, retention, those sorts of things, rather than suggesting that they've got a broader role. So do you think potentially that role deserves to sit somewhere else within an organisation rather than within HR, or is it really more to do with what's the perspective of the governance components or the senior executives in relation to utilising that role?
I think. Well, I'm obviously coming from a government perspective. I think in government, you need to ensure that it's not siloed within, and that's always a danger actually in government, I think in business as well, siloed within an organisation, and there's a role, and as long as that role within the employment, just not just recruitment, but retention, that's ticked off, then fine, that's all done. No, that's not an optimal outcome. You need to be ensuring that the benefits of diversity, and there's lots of evidence around the benefits in decision making, the benefits in problem solving, in work teams, of not just different backgrounds, but different types of thinking, different mindsets, that's inculcated into the organisation, the decision making across the organisation. So I think the risk is always that it becomes something that's seen as a simple task within part of the organisation rather than an opportunity across the entire organisation. I think that's a trap government struggles with, and I think organisations, large private sector organisations also, it's having spoken to a number of them when I was in the role as Multicultural Affairs Minister, also struggle with ensuring that the benefits are actually realised both for themselves and obviously the people who work for them.
And I agree. I think it's a broader governance issue, and it applies in the private sector just as pertinently, I think, as it does in government, because silos are a danger. And when one person is tasked with that selection process, it goes back to, well, what's the culture of the organisation? And if you keep looking for the same kinds of people, you're going to be getting more of the same within. And the same goes for diversity at that board level as well. So I think that culture plays a huge part, and the mindset of organisations in engaging recruiters to actually be selecting recruiters on the basis of how is it that they recruit and where do they seek their talent out from. Because I had a personal experience. I lived in Germany for a few years a long time ago, and when I came back to Melbourne, I was a qualified lawyer before I left, and when I got back to Melbourne, I now had international experience on my CV. I'd worked at Deloitte, and it looked all really impressive, and the recruiters I couldn't find a job. And so for someone who was from Australia, who was educated here, got my law degree here, because I'd spent 3 years outside of the community, coming back in, they couldn't put me in the box. Are you a 5th year family lawyer or 4th year this lawyer or 10th year that lawyer? And because I didn't fit within their preconceived mould, nobody looked at my skills and what I had achieved in Germany. And so it took one person, one partner of a law firm, who actually gave me a chance, because by the time I met him, I'd gone to 20 interviews, and I just said, let me in, let me get my foot in the door, and I'll show you what I can do. And he took a punt. And that's how I got back into the industry that I was educated in. So it says a lot for our perspective when we look to hire people around, we can say we're diverse, but are we really looking at opening the door to people with a skill set that's not common, and that they come from a different life experience? And I think that's the crux of it. So boards really need to implement a good culture within their organisations.
I think sometimes there is a reluctance to deal with discomfort within an organisation, because when you are bringing in people with new ideas or new approaches or different ways of doing things, the reason they revert back to the same people, the same sort of thinking, the same background, is because they don't want to deal with the fact that people will be throwing around new things and people will have to adjust in some way, shape or form. So the culture component, when it comes to business, does require people at those higher, more senior executive levels to be tolerant, I guess, of some degree of, I think conflict is maybe a too strong a word, but potentially some degree of conflict.
But there should be a tension in decision-making processes. People play different roles, and that's actually really important. I know this, I'm speaking from government perspective. Having different points of view, different ways of thinking, different perspectives, and a tension between them in a constructive, healthy way is actually the sign of a healthy organisation. So I think it's really important to understand that if you don't have that tension, you're going to get suboptimal decision makings. You're going to get groupthink. You're going to have mistakes being made because people are not wanting to raise the issue that might be a bit impolite to raise, and it's easier just to let things roll on. And that openness, I think social cohesion is part of it is an openness to diversity and being challenged and having new ideas coming away. And the best organisations, whether that be private sector, government or NGO organisations, are really willing to have that honest disagreement in good faith.
Yeah. Now, Robin, since you're talking about this, because I know you're working within a university context right now, do you think we're actually raising our or training our managers and senior executives to be able to deal well enough with that type of challenging going on within the workplace?
I think to a degree that's the intent. It's not my area of expertise, is sort of in terms of the work that I'm doing there, but I have some interactions with those spaces. I think people are more open to diversity than they once were, but it's always a journey. People are on a journey, and I think there are traps, if I'm being honest, because you define diversity in certain ways and they in fact can mask the complexity of the society in itself, and you can, and I think that's always a challenge. In fact, within diversity and thinking about diversity, people need to be open-minded and challenge their presuppositions all the time within that. Because there's a de-emphasis on, I'll give an example, there's an emphasis on identity politics, a de-emphasis on class. Class hasn't disappeared. So you have to but identity still exists. You have to be flexible and be open within organisations. And I think universities are on a journey, and they have the sort of waves of ideas that sort of wash through them, and there'll be an idea that is predominant, or a set of ideas that are predominant, and so there's a challenge in that, not in themselves having the predominant ideas of the day mask some of the complexity of diversity within a society.
Yeah, I think the key though is being at the coalface, because we can all learn about diversity and we can all apply policies in our workplaces, and even at the board level, what does diversity mean? I often talk about diversity in governance being about skills, not just about ticking boxes and filling certain quotas, etc. But at that theoretical level or technical level of what it is. And then when you interpose that in business and in the business community, I think it's really important that people get that lived experience with community, because it's one thing for policies to be written and initiatives to be created, and it's quite another to experience what that means in practice for people with lived experience. Because I might say, well, I want to be more inclusive in my employment practices, but if I'm getting people that are applying for jobs that have an accent, or who are women over 50, or who are newly arrived migrants or refugees, and I'm focusing on the diversity piece rather than looking at the human being and the skills and they're bringing and how they can enrich my organisation, I think we sort of snooker ourselves a little bit. And with all the good intentions in the world, the door still doesn't open. Yeah. So I think there really needs to be more contact with the cold communities in terms of what skills there are and what cultural barriers they're facing to employment or participation generally in business, in order to make a tangible difference.
Yeah. So you're very involved with chambers of commerce, or one particular chamber of commerce. Do you have a view about what their role is in this area?
Yeah, so I'm the chair of the board of the Hellenic Australian Chamber in Victoria, and we do things a little bit differently. We're very relationship driven. We, of course, are a very, very well established business chamber. We've been around for over 45 years. But in the last decade or so, there has been a marked shift in our focuses. And I think there's no denying that coincided with the instigation of the first female chair of the board, my predecessor, where there was a huge shift. And that in and of itself within the community was a big change. And wasn't welcome necessarily by everybody because they were used to things being done a certain way and within a certain cultural context as well. But the chamber has since just been flying, because we are very, very conscious of panels, for example, discussions, having women in panels, getting business women and women in leaders actively involved in the chamber, the younger generation, talking about diversity, building a bridge between the 20 to 35-year-olds and the really established, successful people and decision makers in business and government, our mentoring program. So there's lots of ways that we can use that sphere of influence within the community to open up the doors and the thinking around what does it mean to be part of a business community, and also inviting speakers that aren't of a Hellenic background, which was never done in the past. So we thought as a board, well, we're becoming very insular in the migrant communities and in multicultural communities. They themselves create their own silos and can become insular because it's what's familiar. It's the same thing. And so in recent years, our speakers for major events have come from far and wide, different backgrounds, different experiences, and it just enriches the experience of the people that come in to the community of the chamber. So we ourselves found that we were being more insular in that respect as well. So it's a mindset that flows both ways, I think, to embrace something different and jump in and participate.
Absolutely. Now, we've talked mostly about sort of within organisations, but do you think that organisations, particularly larger corporate organisations, have a responsibility or an expectation within society that they will have a public face around certain social issues or cultural issues that need to be addressed or could be addressed that would enhance social cohesion? And do you think there's a limit to that?
It's a very contested area, if I'm going to be frank. So I'll be sort of not provocative, but I think that there are shared norms that are not contested around not being discriminatory directly and a view around equality of opportunity. I think there is also some areas which are much more heavily contested in the sort of in a political and then social discourse, which bleeds into businesses' roles. So I think that's and I think it evolves over time. What's within, there's a concept in politics, Overton's window, of what's sort of accepted, and there's sort of an accepted, shared norms around that are rejecting overt discrimination. I think businesses have really direct and accepted responsibilities in that way. I think in terms of what you do about unresolved injustices within the society, I think it's much more heavily contested, and it's much harder, I think, for businesses to navigate that space successfully. I think they still have an important role, because I think there is an expectation in the community that large institutions, whether they be businesses or other community institutions, have roles in those spaces, but it's quite a difficult area for business to navigate because they're heavily contested ideas. But I think if you look to equality of opportunity, ensuring there's no overt discrimination and communicating those ideas, I think there is a broad consensus across the vast majority of society. So I think businesses can sometimes get themselves into quite difficult spaces, but if they can navigate, they can actually send strong messages in support of social cohesion by understanding where there's a consensus in the society.
Do you think they have sort of structural components or governance components within their organisations to help them address those expectations that are constantly changing? Is that something that should just be at the board level and that then informs things, or is there some mechanism? I mean, is it the diversity and inclusion person, or is it somebody else within the organisation should have a responsibility around helping them navigate that?
Well, I think it's a big you see people get into trouble, there's a risk, in terms of public reputation. So I think it's something business organisations need to take more seriously, and I think it goes across from the sort of people who traditionally would work, say, in government relations, who'd have a more political overview, to the governance at a board level, to the people who are working in diversity and inclusion. I think to talk about the silo sort of issues, and government is replete with some of these issues too, not just business. I think you really have to ensure that there's a diversity of opinions seeking to address what are quite complex social issues often, and how business is relating to them.
So, Fotini, because you're with the Governance Institute, so imagine that you've got some views about how organisations should actually be representing themselves externally, but also what the mechanism internally should be to help them with that.
Look, governance frameworks, they really need to be tailored to the organisation to have maximum impact and effect. So I've always been a big believer in you have to make it make sense in order for it to add value and be effective. But I think the private sector's got a really big part to play in being a lot more courageous about these things, because understandably government toes a certain line and has to adhere to certain policies, etc., the government of the day. But governments have the opportunity to change and policies change direction. Private enterprise and the private sector aren't constrained in that way. And so I think the B Corp movement is a really good example of businesses being bold and being brave in saying, this is our purpose and this is what we stand for. So I might be selling outdoor gear, I might be a Patagonia, or I might be selling T2 is a B Corp, or legal services, so my business. But it's really about who are our stakeholders and what do we care about, and being public about it, and actually taking a stand and saying, well, I can be a commercial lawyer doing really big transactions, but I can also care about migrants and refugees and do work for free. And these things are not diametrically opposed and are not able to sit together. So it's about being comfortable with a little bit of discomfort, I suppose. But there are some businesses doing amazing things in this space, not only around diversity for employees, but about the interaction with disadvantaged communities and the role that they can play to be more inclusive and representative. So I think courage is a really big factor that the private sector needs to embrace.
Can you explain a little bit more, in case people don't necessarily know, what a B Corp is and what it takes to be designated as a B Corp?
Yes, so B Corp certification is an international certification that's in Australia. There's B Lab Australia, New Zealand that govern that, and what you're assessed against is an impact assessment report, and there's a very comprehensive process whereby you're assessed on certain pillars, so governance, community, employees, the environment. And so you're assessed against a set of criteria, if you like, and you have to demonstrate what you're doing in those areas. And for larger businesses, they've got to look right up there, supply chain, who they're doing business with. And it's all about businesses using profit for purpose. Mm-hmm. And so every 3 years you need to recertify, and you're competing against yourself. You have to demonstrate that you've improved. So it's not at all tokenistic. It's got a lot of integrity and credibility, and businesses that are B Corps are constitutionally bound to actively make decisions that take into account community, employees, the environment, and things like that. So you have to walk the walk, and you're part of this incredibly dynamic community of like-minded business people that, of course, they're making money, and there's nothing wrong with making a profit, but they're driving change within their community. They're using profit as a power to be courageous and to lead by example, I suppose, and to change the economy.
And could I just add, at an institutional level, you're seeing superannuation funds and other large-scale investors becoming much more aware of those issues, particularly, the frameworks use slightly different language with ESG, but essentially the same issues. And so there's a real risk to organisations that ignore those social responsibilities, that they will find themselves left behind and have large assets, large elements of the capital not available to them. So it's there are fundamental shifts going on across, not just within businesses themselves, but in terms of investment, that are also driving. And government's certainly aware of this and meets, if you look at things like government superannuation funds or some of the other investment funds, they're also under examination of what you can invest in, what's the outcome. There's another frame of reference that's now emerging.
Well, that's a really important one, but also so is young people. So we know that young people have greater expectations of their employers as to the roles that they play on the social side of things. We also know that there is greater emphasis around young people choosing not to necessarily go and work for businesses that they think are not demonstrating things in that way, but actually going down the social enterprise path. So in the last session that we had, there was quite a discussion about young people's attractiveness to social enterprise, because it's their ability to be able to make a contribution back into the community. So, just where you were at before, there is, within larger organisations, they create their corporate social responsibility, but it tends to, it was all very nice at one point, but it did seem to be a little tokenistic. Do you have a view about corporate social responsibility as a vehicle by which business can actually make a contribution, and how do you know if it's real and authentic versus, as you said before, just to tick the box?
I think you can tell beyond a certain point. There are people who are validating these ideas. So this is that there are now processes in place and a range of them, not just one, where people are validating whether something is some sort of astroturfing exercise, and there's a range of euphemisms used, or it actually has some real efficacy. And also, as you're alluding to, people vote with their feet, and their wallets to a degree as well, whether they be institutions, customers, potential employees, I should say. So all of those, there is a reality, and there is in fact a market of ideas that is impacting on business in a way that didn't exist 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah. And even in the listed space, from a governance point of view, listed companies are required to report on these things. Yeah. So CSR, that used to be a line item in the budget a decade ago, is now a really important factor for boards, because consumers do vote with their feet. There are apps that consumers can download that list businesses, for example, that have been dodgy with the ACCC or whatever the case might be, or whether they source coffee beans ethically or whatever the case might be, or sustainable clothing, or things like that. So young people and I think generally the community has a very high expectation of business and of government as well. And so there's a lot of information out there. So I think governments or businesses can't ignore the impact that it has on their stakeholders about how they behave, either as a corporate citizen or as as a government, because they are held to account, which is the great thing about our system. But it's something that should be on that agenda, and that it's all about culture. It's got to trickle through. So if the board cares about it, then hopefully the organisation cares about it, and that will flow through to HR recruitment practices and procurement practices and the likes.
Have you, because you alluded to it before, Fotini, have you got examples of organisations that have worked really well in developing social and community type of projects that have had real impact?
Yes, so of course B Corps come to mind. So Who Gives a Crap is an amazing brand, and it's their mission to provide sanitation and clean water to disadvantaged communities, and they've raised millions of dollars, and they partner with providers within the communities that need the assistance, because it's never a matter of just saying we donated X millions of dollars. Yeah. So they make a huge impact in the communities that they assist. And also another business I recently became familiar with at the assembly of B Corps across Australia and New Zealand a couple of months ago was Awa Period Care. So it's a business in New Zealand that create accessibility to period products for women and girls in New Zealand, and a really significant proportion of the population doesn't have access to what we consider a basic fundamental product to have access to as a woman, and they do really important work within their community and actually help get legislation get passed to make these products free and available to all schoolgirls in New Zealand for a period of time. And so they're working within communities and measuring their impact by actually following up on what the impact has been in terms of how women and girls' participation in school and in work life has increased, because they don't have to stay home for a week, a month. Yeah. So some really fundamental work with huge impact within communities, making a really big difference, because it's part of their mission to care about and include opportunities and benefits to people that otherwise wouldn't have access to them. So, as I said, the private sector's got a lot of power to be bold in that regard.
And certainly there are some organisations that utilise that power. Robin, from your perspective, and particularly given your government experience, do you think there's more that government can actually do to encourage or even to partner with business or industry?
Yes, I think there are examples where you can use that goodwill and that desire to make a social impact, particularly where you've got social issues that are highly concentrated, and there's actually often a small number of people that a bit of help from some businesses would make a huge difference. And there are some good examples I can think of in employment where there's some refugee communities who've got some real challenges, and then partnering with businesses who have that value drive as a core part of their business, you can really make an impact. And so I think it's picking issues where you can get an outcome. So there's it's not a tick box exercise. There's a genuine outcome you can identify, creating that genuine dialogue with business. So there was the discussion earlier about you have to be also taking into account their business needs, and it can't just be something imposed as an impost on business. It needs to be a genuine partnership. And then having tangible goals where you're measuring and having those outcomes. And there's a real clear communication between government about where you're making an impact, what the goals are, and what the communication. And businesses also tend to want to communicate that the good works that they're doing as part of their business model, and that's fine. That's fair enough. They're businesses. They have their brand in a positive way. I'm not using that as a pejorative, but a positive brand to manage. And government. There are obviously some ethical issues that arise in government in some of that, but that can be managed. Yeah. That's something you can be done as well. And government can often step in because government has a much more holistic view of the society and what the issues are. So having those dialogues, those partnerships, the work, and finding those synergies where there's definable issues that are of a scale where a business can make a real difference. You can find, by having that partnership and that approach in a defined area where you can see outcomes and they can be achieved over time, I think there's a really positive role that business and government can have as partners together.
It is really interesting. I like the way you describe that government has this holistic view of society, because sometimes I think community in a general sense, the population, aren't necessarily aware of the complexities that holistic view brings, and then also tend to view business or industry more as all about profit and not necessarily appreciating the value of the work that they do within community. They, just thinking everybody's out for themselves, essentially. So the communication is really important as to how you make sure that the broader population understands that this is coming from the right place and not necessarily that everybody's just getting something out of it.
There was an experience we had through the Chamber during COVID. So the Chamber was actually issuing information in Greek before government gained a bit of traction and started disseminating information. And the communities were trying to support themselves, the multicultural communities. I remember having a meeting with the minister around, how can we reach communities? And it's really about government also looking to utilise the existing infrastructure within those communities, because I'm a child of multicultural background. Of my parents were migrants. My parents wouldn't have left their business to come to Exhibition Street to get a pamphlet about a grant. Yeah. That doesn't happen. They're too busy within their own worlds and their communities and working. And so, but there is infrastructure within communities. Like there are lots of multicultural chambers of commerce. There are lots of community organisations within different spheres that already have that touch point. So if government comes to those, and radio stations and multicultural newspapers, government can really effectively make an impact through that infrastructure, rather than saying, well, how do we bring the policy to the people and how do we get them to know about it, which is a real struggle. And organisations that are at the coalface. So, for example, Sister Works is a wonderful organisation that I do some pro bono work with, because they've got a program whereby a business startup program. So I come in and do the legal support and education around how women from refugee and migrant backgrounds can start a business. So by providing funding to organisations like that, or many other organisations within the community that have the grassroots work cut out for them and that are making a really huge impact on the ground, would actually make that government dollar go a lot further, because government can be a real instigator of change and a champion of change if they partner with the organisations in the community that are already impacting directly the people that need that. So I think we need to think about it at a sort of a kind of a hybrid model at a high level policy grant level. But people who don't know English and who haven't got access to computers can't apply for grants. And it's a complicated process applying for a grant, and it takes a lot of time. And so the next level of people that fall through that net are the people that have interactions with the infrastructure within their community that they're finding support from. So I think a multi-level approach or a multi-tiered approach might be good.
I think that's a really important set of points, because one of the observations I'd make is that people in government tend to come from a university-educated, literate culture, where words and, in fact, often complex technical language is the parlance in which people operate. And whereas often small business people from a non-English speaking background will live in a very different world. And so I think that insight and the ability to understand that how government operates and how it communicates is not necessarily going to be relevant or accessible to a large sections of the community, and then overcoming that challenge of not just communication but culture, and not just culture of people coming from a non-English speaking background, but how people live their lives, how they interact, how people are engaging with systems of rules, how they're living their lives on a day-to-day basis in their business. I think it's really important that those touch points exist within the community to get those insights and to be able to empathise with a very different way of living. Because I think people live very different lives. If you're in and the response too often, I think, in government can be to add an additional rule, to create a new set of guidelines.
Correct. Yes.
To create
it's all very technical.
To create more complexity to deal with the problem. And for many people in the society, particularly from some of the more disengaged communities who may not have English, maybe a second language, or from people who are not university educated more broadly in the community, that actually can create additional barriers to participation. So I think those touch points, and I think some of the ethnic community business councils are one good example. I think media, but there's others across society, including in some outside of migrant communities. I think understanding how you can best engage and having those bridging organisations that sort of allow for that engagement is utterly critical.
So, Robin, I recall when you were Minister for Multicultural Affairs that one of the things that you really did do over the period of time that you were there was really engage with communities at the grassroots level, right, at the coalface, as you say. So that then if I'm correct, I think then you went on to be the Minister for Finance.
Well, so I was Minister for Finance at the same time. Yeah.
So, but there aren't many politicians who get the opportunity to really spend time with individuals in community. And so I'm wondering how do you think that helped to influence the other roles that you took on?
I think a lot. I mean, I think there's always a tension between the subjective and the abstract, so between statistics and subjective experience. I'm sure in your own roles, it's a tension you deal with. And I think you need both. You need to have that direct subjective experience and listen to what people have to say and understand their experiences, their lives, the challenges for, say, a small business person in a strip shopping centre somewhere in the suburbs is a very different experience than someone working in a Collins Street corporate office, but they're still living in the same society with the same government and having to deal with institutional systems that have broad similarities. So I think you need to do both. So you need to have a contextualised broad view, but then have a more nuanced understanding from that direct engagement. And I think it's a challenge always. This is a real challenge in our community, that to get those two viewpoints. And I think having those direct engagements, meeting people, talking to them, getting the different perspectives, and to go back to where we started in a way, being open-minded, and be willing to change your presuppositions, and challenge yourself at all times, I think is really critical. So I think those institutions within the society, the way I conceptualise it is you have the sort of governing institutions, you have large players, you have smaller players, and you have people in community, and the community experiences are very diverse in a society like ours, very diverse. And not just talking about ethnic or cultural background, but the sort of lives we lead are quite diverse. We constantly at the moment, and particularly with this sort of world of algorithms and social media and the way it silos us, to have those bridges between people and I think the subjective experience of people's lives is a critical element of that, of having that understanding and empathy. And it's really about empathy and empathising, and you need the statistical analysis, you need to quantify, you need to understand where issues are, what the emerging trends are. Within that, you also really need to disaggregate. And I think the disaggregation to allow for more nuanced responses, for diversity of response actually to the needs of the community, is having that combination of good data, disaggregated data, so you're seeing not just averages but what the expressions are at the good and bad ends of a curve, but also the subjective, validating those issues and getting greater insights through the subjective experiences of people in community.
It really is about building trust. I'm interested, Fotini, from the Hellenic community's perspective, especially over the past decades. Do you get the sense that the Hellenic community feels like things have progressed, that they actually have more of a voice, that they have the ability to be heard for what the issues are that are specific to them?
Oh, I think so, but of course the Hellenic community has been here for a very long time, and it's a very established migrant community. There's over 500,000 of us just in Melbourne alone. And so I think they definitely have a voice. You've got people of Hellenic background in politics, in all sorts of senior decision-making roles. That second and third generation is really coming through. And so I don't think that the Hellenic community is a community without a voice, in contrast to other more newly established communities. And I think the roles of chambers of commerce and newspapers and radio stations within our community that were instituted and funded by private families mostly have really been the reason why there's such a presence. And we've got, there's a street, we close down the city for a street festival every year, and there's lots of wonderful things that established multicultural communities do now. but 50 years down the track. So I think we're all a product of our lived experience, as you've pointed out, also with your experience in government. But for me, for example, I grew up in the back of food businesses. My parents had businesses my whole life. That experience of being part of business in a community where in the community we lived in the 80s wasn't very welcoming to migrants, and I dealt with a lot of racism at school, etc., which is something my children now don't even have to worry about. So we've progressed. But the skills in that lived experience have made me a much better lawyer, have enabled me to build skills to be able to genuinely be able to connect with literally anybody and care about relationship as opposed to only transactions, and change that mindset. Like your lived experience with the multicultural community has coloured your view of other roles in more bureaucratic, I suppose, contexts. And so giving people to live that experience, I think, is important. When people put themselves up for positions in electorates at local and state elections, and they're not your usual politician, whatever that mould is, an Anglo-Saxon kind of person, and looks a bit like actually opening up politics so that there's more representation, because when communities see themselves in those positions, it lifts up that confidence, I suppose. And so that's a really important way that we can ensure that groundswell of impact and social cohesion can really come to the fore.
I think you make a really good point about the Hellenic community is actually everywhere within society at every level and every type of role you could possibly imagine, and how valuable that is to our society and our community continuing to be as egalitarian and welcoming as it possibly can be. So on that very positive note, I would like to thank both of you for having been here and being part of this podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you, and we've covered a lot of things in relation to business and industry and social cohesion. So it's been a real pleasure. So thank you both very much. Thank you for listening to our Voices of Australia podcast. For more episodes like this one, you can visit the Scanlon Institute website at scanloninstitute, or one word, .org.au.